Welcome to Aston Means Business. I'm Steve Dyson, the journalist presenting this regular podcast for Aston Business School. It's subtitled SMEs Building Resilience to COVID-19 Challenges. We're interviewing small business leaders who are taking part or who've recently taken part in Aston Centre for Growth's programmes. They're sharing their experiences and explaining how they're developing their operations during these uncertain economic times. We're also talking to some of Aston Business School's top academics, getting their valuable insight, analysis and advice for SMEs. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking to Helena Hogarth. She's the founder, owner and operator of Hogarths Hotels, which has 2 luxury venues in Solihull and Kidderminster. The pandemic lockdowns have hit the business hard, with 90% plus of revenues disappearing. That's more than £6 million a year. This has seen Helena and her remaining staff embarking on an entire rebrand, switching from large corporate events to hoped-for smaller gatherings and the emerging staycations market. Here listening to my interview is Dr. Rob Thomas, a teaching fellow in marketing and strategy at Aston Business School. He's been assisting Hogarths Hotels with their reorientation. Hello to you, Rob.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Rob. Thanks for agreeing to take part again in this podcast. We'll have a good chat once we've heard my interview with Helena Hogarth.
Great, thank you. And thanks for having me back.
Hello to you, Helena.
Hello.
Helena, let's get to know you a little bit first. What were you doing before you became a hotelier, and what tempted you into running your own hotels?
Oh, well, I didn't really plan to run hotels. In fact, quite the opposite. My grandparents and parents were in the hotel trade, and I was fairly certain I didn't want to follow in their footsteps. But lo and behold, that is what actually happened. I went to university and qualified as a solicitor and was doing commercial property law, which I'm afraid I wasn't terribly keen on. So after various discussions with my husband, we decided to buy a bed and breakfast in Solihull, largely because I wanted to live near the Solihull Riding Club, which is next door, because I loved horse riding. But actually, it sort of changed our path, really.
I understand that you now have 2 establishments, but they're more than your average hotels, aren't they? Tell us more about the Solihull and the Kidderminster venue and how they've developed as Hogarth Hotels.
We started with the Solihull Hotel. I say we, my husband jokes that he thought he was just going to live in a nice house and I started taking in guests. But it was an 8-bedroomed bed and breakfast property, which was fairly run down. And it just sort of took off, really. It just got really busy. There was a lot of different parts of the property that weren't being used. So we gradually, as the business developed, converted more areas into further bedrooms. And we went from 8 to 12 and then 17 and then 19. And eventually also got planning permission for some new bedrooms, which was another block of 30 bedrooms.
Wow.
And further banqueting facilities and so on. So, so it's now got 49 bedrooms and conference rooms and big event areas.
And what about the Kidderminster Hotel? When did that come on the scene?
Yeah, that was another emotional purchase, really. So we weren't really looking to buy another hotel at the time, but Stone Manor was a property that I used to go to as a child. As I mentioned, my grandparents were in the hotel business and they were in Birmingham city centre. So they used to take in largely travelling salesmen, really, from a Sunday night to a Friday morning. And then by Friday afternoon, we'd all go out and we'd head off to Stone Manor for dinner or over the course of the weekend. So all of our family events took place there. Particularly remember my grandfather's 70th there. It had become a shadow of its former self, really. So it'd been owned by the same person for 30 years and not really had any investment. So it's decent size. It's 56 bedrooms in 30 acres, similar to the Solihull property. And we did a major refurb, so refurbished the whole property, all of the bedrooms, all of the banqueting, the restaurant. Yeah, and so that's running alongside now the Solihull one.
And before COVID, Helena, what was the main focus of both hotels? And just give us an idea of the staffing and the pre-COVID turnover.
Depending on the time of the year and the day of the week, a little bit really. So, sort of Monday to Thursday tends to be conference and corporate. So, business events, the bedrooms, obviously, usually for business days, and the restaurant on each site. And then at the weekend tend to be more family occasions, so birthdays, christenings, weddings. Do quite a lot of weddings at both sites. Before COVID, we had about 100 members of staff on each site, and the turnover was probably 7-ish million in normal times.
It sounds like such a thriving business, the two hotels together. So much so, Helena, that I almost don't want to ask about what happened when COVID-19 emerged. It must have had a disastrous impact.
Yeah, it was quite extreme, really. In fact, sometimes it's quite hard to believe that it's happening. So basically, in lockdown one, both hotels were required to close. And the first thing we had to do was try and manage our outgoings, really, not knowing how long we were going to be closed for. So we started preparing for significant redundancies on both sites. We were just going through that process when the furlough scheme was announced. That saved some jobs. We still had a number of redundancies, and we had a lot of sort of described as casual workers, so maybe students or local young people that would just work at the weekends and holidays and things. And we just haven't had any work for them. We haven't had any work for anybody. So we opened just for a short period of time last summer as soon as the lockdown one was eased. But really, other than that, have been closed most of the year and haven't really had work for most of the workforce. In terms of the downturn, it was probably over 90% of the revenues. So we could still do restaurant, but for us, restaurant was a very small part of the business. Without the bedroom guests, the restaurant was less in demand anyway.
Gosh, Helena, it sounds awful. 90% down from 7 million is literally more than £6 million off your balance sheets. How has the business survived? And do you see guests and revenues returning once lockdown ends and restrictions start to lift again?
Well, I certainly hope they start to return pretty quickly. We've just had to rethink everything that we do. I'm not sure that business travellers will come back quickly or even in the same way. So I can imagine that even though the government says people are allowed to travel, that's going to take some time to filter down into companies' travel plans, because a lot of companies themselves have got travel restrictions on their teams to keep them safe. So although the government says people can travel, I'm not convinced that they will quickly be travelling to the extent they were pre-lockdown. So we've had to try and think about what we can do differently or instead. And what we've done is reduce a lot of our bigger event spaces into smaller rooms. The layout of our buildings has made that relatively straightforward. So that rather than taking a big group, we can take several smaller groups or gatherings or parties. So whereas our events used to be over 100 people, I don't really see that happening in the near future. So we've sort of reconfigured for probably 20s or 30s. A lot of the team members have also developed their skills. We've been working on our website and our IT offering. We've rebranded, which we'd started pre-lockdown, but we've had a bit more time to think about that than we might have otherwise had. We've redecorated everywhere. We're also developing a spa product at Solihull because it seems that the staycation market is going to be really popular over the next few years. I think there'll be a reluctance to travel abroad. So we're hoping that we can benefit from that. And then we're looking at how we can accommodate weddings. So we probably do about 100 weddings per year on each site. So we need to hopefully still offer those, but with different numbers, depending on how the restrictions pan out.
How have you managed to keep going as a business?
We've certainly had to put up a lot of our personal resources into the businesses to keep them going, and we have had significant government support. I think the furlough scheme has been a lifesaver. Without that, we really would have been in trouble, and it's encouraging to see that that's being extended until September. Although, in some ways, that also becomes a worry then that the government may be thinking we need to remain closed until September, or maybe the lockdown being eased isn't going to happen in the time period that's been suggested.
Yeah, the uncertainty must be really hard. I mean, from what you've said, you've completely changed the style of your hotel's offerings, rethinking everything based on the customers you predict will still be there, and even putting your own resources into the business. But aside from those efforts, what can the government now do to help the hotel and hospitality sector?
I think the VAT is a big thing, so that helps us make a bit effectively more margin on what we are selling. The other massive help is the business rates holiday, and hopefully that will continue to support hospitality businesses for as long as possible, because that's a massive outgoing that we would really struggle with at the moment.
What you've gone through is quite a tumultuous time in terms of your revenues being hit by 90%, the redundancies, having to change all the offerings at the hotel. How have you kept on with that personally as the owner of the business, and what continues to drive you?
That's a tricky one. Depends often on what time of day you're asking me. um, it has been really hard, but I think as the business leader, I've got to be the one that remains optimistic to keep motivating the team around me. I went on the Aston Small Business Growth Programme together with two of the senior managers, from each hotel, which has sort of helped keep us positive and thinking about how we can pivot the business and what different revenue streams we can attract and how we can reposition ourselves to take advantage of that. We've been working with Rob Thomas, also from Aston, who's helped us with the rebranding, refreshing what we do, pricing, target markets, and that kind of thing. I think it was just a bit of headspace to actually think about things that we all know about, like marketing and who our customers are and how we appeal to them. And just really having time to think about what those things are in a way that sort of in the day to day we wouldn't really focus on.
You talked about yourself being the leader of the company and how you have to keep going and keep positive for your staff. What do you say to your staff to keep them going?
I think actually they've been amazing. they really motivate me as much as me motivating them. One of our team is Josh. He's like the perpetual optimist. Whatever's happened, he always sees the positive in it and opportunities. So I think between us, we'll just find a way to make it work, and we're all feeling the same way and hopeful for the future.
Helena Hogarth, the owner and operator of Hogarths Hotels, many thanks for joining us, and I really do wish you the very best for the future of your hotels as the UK continues to emerge from lockdown.
Thanks, Steve. Great to talk to you, and hopefully we'll get to meet in one of the hotels soon.
Hopefully still with me is Dr. Rob Thomas, a teaching fellow in marketing and strategy at Aston Business School. Hello again, Rob.
Hi, great, thank you. I can hear you loud and clear. I'm very much looking forward to this.
Great. Rob, you were name-checked in that interview, so let's start by asking how you got to know Helena and Hogarth's Hotels and what you've been working on with them.
Well, I'm very much involved with the Centre for Growth at Aston and the Small Business Programme. So I have the pleasure, and I do mean that quite sincerely, of dealing with small business owners, managers, and those looking to expand on a regular basis. And we try to provide them with insight and strategic direction as how they might combat not just COVID, but how they might be more sustainable going forward in the broad sense. So I had the pleasure of meeting Helena and her team through that process. And I was running a session on looking at some of the basic elements of branding and how you might develop a brand to relocate your business within this sort of very, very difficult business environment we currently have. As a consequence of that, I was approached by them for some help and advice. I was more than willing to impart, and we've developed a relationship as a consequence of that. So I am pleased to be helping Helena and her team to try and navigate and provide some solutions to their current problems.
This was a huge problem for Hogarths Hotels, though, wasn't it? I mean, they suffered a 90% hit in revenues. That's taking more than £6 million off what was a £7 million annual turnover. How on earth can you help them solve that when hotels aren't even open again?
I think firstly and foremostly, what has happened to Helena's business and indeed others is absolutely profound, and it almost seems to try and offer insight into that sense. But what I've tried to do with Helena is move her away from this sort of resource-based view of we need to plough money into this and that and the other and try to relocate that. But looking at elements that are internal in relation to trying to understand how you're perceived within a market, what your competitors are doing, how you might realign what you do to stop competing per se, but to develop a very distinct and natural and differentiated place within this very, very difficult market at the moment. There's no guarantee that you can do that, but that's what I'm very much trying to develop with Helena and her team. So we're looking at repositioning them, looking at different, perhaps more sustainable segments for their business going forward, but developing a more of what we call a proactive approach to what is happening. And rather than relying on what they've always done, looking for new opportunities within that. We're looking at repositioning the brand contextually from what they've been, which was almost a broad multi-segment proposition, to trying to capitalize on these new cultural trends within the macro environment and moving away from reliance on large audiences to fill the void there. We're also looking for trying to reconfigure what the brand means. Interestingly, with Helena, they hadn't necessarily considered what their mission and vision was. They didn't have that distinct direction, but we're also reconsidering the personality of the brand and trying to recreate or create more of a human metaphor within the brand so people can actually engage, because primarily people want to engage with brands that reflect who they are, and we're trying hard to do that. Importantly as well, we are trying to establish what the voice of the brand is in terms of audit, so we can create a new tone, find new platforms and find new ways of communicating Helena's fantastic brand. However, the caveat to that is these elements may not necessarily be unique, but through a process of redaction, we're trying to establish what is valuable about Helena's brand to a given audience, and that's one of the keys. But I think simplicity is the key here. Try to understand what your position is in the market. Try to understand how people perceive of you. Try to understand what your competitors are doing. But I think the key thing for Helena is that she has brought some of her key members of staff into the decision-making process. She's got very much a participative leadership style now, and that is offering more and more voice, and it's allowing her to develop more and more ideas that might go forward.
I guess that although the position for Hogarths Hotels was stark, at least they had this hands-on owner in terms of Helena. She's not only prepared to put extra efforts in, but also to help the business to survive by investing her own private funds. Not all hotels and other hospitality businesses have that resource, do they?
No, they don't. And I think one of the issues perhaps listening to this is becoming fixated with the revenue and indeed the loss of revenue. But I would be at pains to point out that what we're doing with Helena has cost nothing at this juncture. Redefining what your brand is, asking people how they perceive of your brand is not something that is rich in costs. Carrying out internal audit is not something that costs money by definition. Trying to understand what your competitors are doing, it doesn't cost money. In 2021, the ability to benchmark your competitors is a simple question of going online, no more, no less, and you're able to understand their segment, their market share, the people they're trying to engage with, their product portfolio, pricing structures, and what indeed might make them unique as well. But what Helena's doing, and again, I would re-emphasize for all business owners, this costs nothing. It's being proactive in gathering information. That's what we're doing at the moment, no more, no less. The more information we have, the more proactive we can be. And that is the key to realignment in COVID, rather than relying on what you have done, being generative. You need to be generative. Find out as much as you can to try and realign your brand or what you're going to do. However, the caveat to this, and I've explained this to Helena and her proactive team, this is not a simple solution. This is not an overnight proposition. There are no guarantees, as we know fundamentally in business, even at the best of times. So this is a slow burn, but it's a proactive burn. I would encourage anybody to start at ground zero and try to realign what they're doing through this process.
There's some really good advice here, Rob. For hotels and other hospitality businesses out there, what's the priority takeaway? In a nutshell, if their businesses have gone bump in the night due to COVID or whatever, if most of their revenues have gone, what should they do first?
Look, I think, when that scenario happens, you can lose clarity, and I completely understand that, and it's very easy talking about it. But my advice to anybody would be to go back to basics. What do we want to be known for, and how do we want to take that forward? What happens in scenarios like this is that people start to compete very, very broadly and very widely, and they lose the essence of what they are. And occasionally what people tend to do, they start cutting prices, they start to compete on price, and that's a slippery road to ruin for any business, regardless of the scenario we find ourselves in. To go back, what is your mission? What do you want to be known for? What value do you add? How are you different from your competitors? Take time to really establish those frameworks. And once you know that, you have a clearer understanding of who you are. What you can do then is, using those structural building blocks, is try to find out where you want to go strategically over the next perhaps 3 to 5 years. And by aligning that direction, what you're giving yourself is essentially, I call it a tom-tom. It's almost a satellite navigation process. It gives you a route. Now, you may deviate from that. You may have to deviate from that. But ultimately, you will come back to this decision-making process. You will come back to this road, because that's what you want to be known for. And what I do know emphatically is, once you have that recognition, people will go on the journey. Naturally, you have to manage relationships, you have to be adaptable and so on, but people will go on that journey. But one of the key things to this is understanding how do you develop relationships as well. Relational marketing, relational strategy is the key to developing long-term success. And that's something to build into these frameworks as well. But also acknowledging, and I would re-emphasize that point I made a few moments ago, you need to be flexible. Strategies, regardless of COVID, are emergent. Take your time. The moment that you say, well, we want to earn £1 million and you don't, that's not failure. You must be adaptive in that context. And in a road like this, developing that framework, very much like Helena has done, to try and be proactive against what might come is a key aspect. Don't become too blinkered in what you do. And through all of these elements, you can revitalize your brand by going back to basics. You have a wonderful chance to revitalize who you are, change perception of who you are, and then relaunch. And this is a good, strong, systematic process.
And finally, Rob, back to Hogarths Hotels and all the efforts they've put into reorientation to grab new markets once hospitality reopens. Have they done enough? Can Hogarths Hotels recover?
Look, that's a huge question. I'm firmly of the belief, given the commitment they have, given the determination, they will be successful. But the caveat for Helena and anybody listening to this, that is a slow burn. There are no guarantees. But from my experience working with businesses and particularly small, medium enterprises, it's ultra competitive. But if you're prepared to put in the time to understand the detail of what you're doing, there's a strong possibility that you will be successful. But it's time rich. It is a slow burn, it is incremental, but the greatest resource you have at this juncture particularly is time, and time spent realigning, reevaluating who you are and where you want to go, I firmly believe will pay dividend for you.
Dr. Rob Thomas, a teaching fellow in marketing and strategy at Aston Business School, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks also to Helena Hogarth of Hogarths Hotels. Aston means business. SMEs building resilience to COVID-19 challenges. Thanks for listening.